Hello and welcome to Fired Up. My name's Morgan McLintic, and today I'm joined by Chris Ulbrich. Hey, Chris.
Hey, great to be here.
And Ian Lipner.
Hey there.
Today, we're going to be talking about media relations, and specifically a part of media relations called rapid response. And we'll be talking about what that is, how to do it, best practices, some common mistakes. But before we get into that, it's Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving to you both.
Yeah, I think this is one of your favorite holidays, Morgan.
It absolutely is my favorite holiday. Getting everyone together with your friends and your family, taking some downtime, being thankful. Tomorrow is going to be a bit more commercial, but this day is not that commercial. I just think it's just a wonderful celebration. So I really enjoy it. A great, great tradition. So let's dive in to talk about rapid response. Set us up then, Chris. When we talk about rapid response in media relations, what do we mean?
Yeah, it's a big question because the definition has changed over the years, certainly in the time that I've been in PR. When I started, rapid response had a fairly narrow meaning, which was a proactive pitch that you made into breaking news. Another term for it would be like an experts available pitch. And another term that has become common over the years is newsjacking.
Ooh.
Oh, you're right. So I have some opinions about that. But before getting into those opinions, just to give a bit of a broader definition, the idea is that something's happened in the news that one of your clients, if you're in an agency, or the company you work for, if you're in-house, has an angle on. And knowing that reporters will be writing about this story, you're trying as the PR person to get your client's point of view into the news. And typically this takes the form of pitching an expert perspective from one of your spokespeople or pitching research that you've developed in-house. Those are the two main ways that you would do it. Now, this practice has come to be known by a lot of people as newsjacking. I don't really like that term, to be honest. I mean, sometimes use it for the sake of having a common language, but it encapsulates everything about the wrong way to be successful in this kind of pitch. Because for one, the language implies an adversarial relationship with the news and with the reporter. It's a hostile takeover of a story. And on top of that, I think that while you do need to be fast and aggressive in a way to be successful with this kind of pitch, because typically they need to be executed on really tight deadlines. It's also characteristic of this sort of opportunity. To be successful, you need to be useful to the reporter. And if you start off with this idea that you're going to be some kind of buccaneer taking over their story, you're already off on the wrong foot. I think also, especially for, an agency like ours, which works with early stage companies, it misunderstands the balance of power in the relationship. Your value to the reporter you're trying to influence is as an expert, as someone who can be a useful voice in their story. And I prefer to come at it from a more collaborative point of view. And, as we talk about this more, I know I'm going to keep coming back to that because I really believe that success in this area depends on how prepared you are to be useful to the media. And having said all that about the classic definition of rapid response, we should note that the definition has expanded more recently to include what are classically known as, or traditionally known as, calls for sources. So a reporter will say, hey, I'm writing a story on X topic and I need by 3:00 Eastern, I need someone to weigh in on such and such topic, right? These are actually pretty different disciplines because one is reactive, you're reacting to a call for sources, and one is proactive. You're contacting a reporter who isn't even expecting necessarily to hear from you. But the preparation you do to be successful in each of these kinds of pitch is similar. And in practice, I think the call for sources, especially for earlier stage startups, is the more common way to execute. And luckily, as we'll discuss, the preparation you do is similar.
Ian, what do you think about newsjacking? It's a nice phrase, right? But as Chris says, it does sound like you're hijacking the story. And That's an adversarial position that I don't think that startups should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between being the right kind of source to actually help tell that story and being tangentially related and trying to show all of the other places that story will impact, which I do think there's a place for, but maybe that's not the first day. And I think there's a continuum here that goes from the rapid response, like I have the right source for you. You're talking about something in my industry that we are particularly expert about, through to that affects things in my industry too, and here's why, through to what amounts to a proactive PR campaign and pitching those angles later.
But if you think about, hey, these issues are happening in the world, there are stories being written about it, but maybe my reporter in my sector, I'm in cybersecurity, wants to write about this national issue. How do we ladder that up? What are the implications to my sector? You can proactively pitch that reporter, knowing that they might be writing about that and having the same question and offering up your client with a take and an explanation. And the rapid part here is they may not already, before this news broke, have known what their position was, right? They'd have to develop that quickly. And then you have to jam on it and get it in front of the reporter while they're writing their story, or as they're gathering their sources for this story and framing it out. And therefore, speed is really important in this sort of proactive news jacking type of story. So that's why. But you're really thinking here about this story is happening whether we're part of it or not. And if we want to be part of it, we've got to get in there quick. When we think about this, it's a proactive media relations. How does it fit into the overall PR program, Chris?
You would classify it as part of your proactive program. And you would develop the materials for it alongside your development of external facing messages, for instance. I think we'll probably talk more in a bit about best practices, but in general, this is the most timely and fast moving part of your proactive campaign. So typically when you are planning out a PR campaign, you will identify timely topics that you could conceivably have a view on, and then hopefully build those out with your clients' SMEs and so forth. And then you set those alongside larger set piece stories, packages that you're hoping to put together with data, with customers, partners, your highly developed points of view, maybe white papers, where you are trying to provide the material for a more developed feature story. So the preparations for these different kinds of proactive pitch, they're all related. They're all on a sort of spectrum. There's going to be some overlap between the type of large set piece stories that you prepare for and the highly targeted, fast moving ones. But in this case, it will start with some forethought about what is likely to happen in the world. What are reporters likely to be writing about that we're going to need to move on quickly?
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think thinking about all of the areas that you might be able to comment and overlaying that over what the likely media topics are during the Imagine campaign or the Envision campaign. It's really important to being able to know what kinds of things that you need to be ready to discuss. I've found it useful for the most likely cases to actually create sort of mini holding statements, if you will, like starters for the response. A lot of the ability to go fast is because of preparing a lot in advance. And the more permutations you have because of the active execution of rapid response, the richer your campaign gets, the more angles you find that can inform those larger set pieces. A good PR team is constantly evolving that and might even find sort of new messaging opportunities that keep coming up that a brand can participate in because of that sort of organic work of the daily in the trenches. What are people talking about today? What do we have to say about that? Because you might not have envisioned a number of changes in the market or the political landscape or whatever it is that can inform how we are going to go out quickly. So that process of creating even those basic statements, which could include an ellipses at the end, that will fill it in for that particular scenario, is something that I think strengthens everybody on the team because they know there's more to look out for and they know how to take the first step once there is a journalist that's interested.
So as an example, you look at a trend, AI agents. Okay. AI agents are being built. What do they mean? Who's actually doing it? What are the benefits? What's the architecture? What are the security risks, et cetera, et cetera? You know that this is going to be written about. You can identify the reporters who are likely to be shaping opinion and be at the forefront of that. You can then say, all right, we have something to say about this. What's our part of it? Okay, we're coming at it. We're AI governance company. We're coming at this from a security and privacy compliance perspective. Here are these agents. They're extremely connected and they're driving inquiries across multiple other algorithms and data sets. This is a problem, and that might be you're into that. So then you prepare your quotes around that. You have your photo of the spokesperson. You maybe have a customer or an analyst who can then also ladder up if they want, and the spokesperson, who's our go-to person. And maybe you even you talk to them and have an SME call specifically about this in advance, in anticipation that this is going to come up and we want to be part of it. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And we often see this even looking at broader predictions about the market. Everybody's going to be doing them here at the end of the year. And you sit down and you have a quarterly conversation with your client about which of these things that seems to be in the zeitgeist are we good at talking about right now? We did this with Gen AI, I think, earlier than a lot of agencies a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like, we think this is coming. What will you be ready to say? And that enables you to figure out, okay, do we have what it takes to participate in a very competitive message landscape? Right? Because you don't always. And it's important to not encourage your client or to not encourage your company to step into some massive wave or torrent, I should say, and not really have what it takes to rise to the top. It's just wasted energy. So it takes a lot of, let's be honest about, do we have what it takes to participate in that conversation?
Same as thought leadership. Do you actually have a leading thought here? And do we actually have some credibility? And is it going to move our business forward? Or is what we're going to say just generic and the same as everybody else? And we'll often push back on, okay, I've heard that from 10 other companies. Like, anyone could say that. But what can you say that only you can say? Because otherwise, if you just push out something generic, you're not going to get covered. So that leads me to think a little bit, Chris, how are expectations and practices changing? You said before these marketplaces for journalist inquiries existed, proactive media pitching was just coming up with a likely list and pitching into it. Now there are these marketplaces for these things, but how have things changed?
Oh my gosh, such a big topic. Let's just go back 15 years, let's say.
Okay.
I can remember when I got into the business, all of us junior PR people would be sitting in a sort of bullpen and all working on various tasks for our different clients. And it would be common, even for people in other offices, to say, hey, I just talked with such and such a reporter, and they're by their phone, they're picking up, and they're just taking pitches. And that feels like another world at this point.
And everyone would have at it, because that poor person would then get called and emailed like by every team, because the flag has gone up and here we go. And sometimes the article would come out and there's 5 clients from the same agency in this article, and for our agency and others, I could literally see the articles. I'm like, I know, like, all of these clients are all working with the same agency.
Yes. Now, in a case where a reporter is actually actively gathering sources for a particular story, I was actually talking about the days when a reporter would just pick up the phone and just take random pitches because they were collecting ideas. The very concept of sort of a media environment where reporters had the leisure for a few hours a day to just shoot the breeze with PR people and gather ideas, or that's the way that they would do it. It's a very different world today. And I think that a lot of that information gathering that used to flow from sources to reporters And here I'm talking about tech. In areas like politics, it may very well still flow the traditional way. But in tech, I think a lot of that source gathering has moved to social media, and reporters are depending much more on their social networks to decide who they're going to be reaching out to for input. They're viewing their beat areas, are keeping an eye on people who are participating in conversations. They're watching out for people with interesting perspectives, and they are depending on those people increasingly that for input on stories, as opposed to just fielding cold calls, so to speak, or cold emails from sources they've never heard of. Now, to be clear, this was always the way to some extent. Relationships always gave you the inside track. But I think with social media, there's this, what was described as a parasocial relationship, where people feel they know you from social media, even if they haven't interacted with you directly, and that gives them a comfort with you. So I think the lesson there is that you are extremely unlikely to have success reaching out to a reporter on a timely topic if that reporter does not know your spokesperson, does not know you. I think relationships are even more important today than they were. So in addition to all the block and tackling of messaging and perspective preparation you need to do, if you want to be successful pitching into timely news, you and your SMEs also need to be visible to the right reporters on social media. Now, a reporter who's putting out a call for sources, I think, is going to be much more open to hearing from someone they've never heard from before. And different reporters will work different ways. If you're in the tech trades, there are certain reporters who really rely on listservs and these subscription services for putting out calls for sources, the kind of tools you mentioned, Morgan. They put out a call. They expect 20 or 30 companies to weigh in. They pick 5 perspectives they want, and they assemble that into a story. That's why pitching into an op like that, it's a different discipline from pitching into breaking news. But it is why I say that at the core, success for both of these requires pre-approved content, pre-thought through perspectives that you can deploy on quickly, short notice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there still are those journalists who have a lifelong Rolodex that they're building. And I'm thinking of one security journalist in particular who began a briefing and said, well, I haven't talked to you since you were at, and then looked up 2 companies previous for the spokesperson. So there are those who are orienting toward those long-term relationships still. But more folks are, I think, just, hey, who's got this fastest to me? And who among the trusted people I can recognize before, I've seen before. I might look up their name in my prior emails already to see if they've pitched me in the past. One thing we also found is that when we were going out with rapid response, often journalists, again, they retain their emails and they'll look for folks who have offered up expertise along a certain topic just with an email search. So what might sound like an antiquated tactic of doing an initial intro and saying, hey, we're the PR firm of record now, or I'll be handling calls for this SME at your company. That can actually end up being part of what they see as first party data, if you will, their own sort of information about the market versus throwing it out there. I think people moving quickly on more esoteric topics who aren't necessarily accustomed to covering them a lot are more likely to use these services, right? Like the lifestyle reporter who wants to get in touch with a nutritionist or something like that, or where they're not focused on covering food all the time, that kind of thing. But I will say that I do believe that the rapidity of the response that they get has changed the nature of rapid response, right? Like some stories are intraday, but trade stories used to be like, hey, let's take a couple weeks to put together my sources and all that. And I suspect that some of those folks can go ahead, load the query into, Quoted and get 7, 8 answers that look pretty good and close off the query. And that's it, right? And so that window for reaching those journalists is smaller and more rapid, even for a story that might not come out for a few weeks.
You just mentioned that actually the email, like the journalist's email inbox is a first-party repository for finding sources, and therefore is something that a lot of reporters use. And therefore, as comms pros, sending in an intro email or at least laying out, I've spoken to people about this topic is a good trend. And it just made me think tools like Superhuman, which have added Ask AI to them, which specifically builds a chatbot on top of their first-party email database, is going to make that even easier. Who do I know who's an expert in this particular topic? You're going to come up if you're in their inbox. And so I wonder whether that will make that a little bit easier.
Honestly, that is a really interesting point, because I know I just was working with one reporter that I know uses Superhuman. I should ask. I mean, I think this Ask AI feature is fairly new.
It is new, but you could imagine it's going to get rolled out to Gmail. Will have it. Gemini will have a Gemini version, and there'll be Copilot. We'll see. We'll see. Now, we've mentioned a couple of tools already here, and I want to just, for those that are unfamiliar, Quoted, what was HARO and is now Sources for Sources or Sources on Sources. There's ProfNet still lingering around. And just explain what those are.
These are services that some of them are free and some of them charge for folks like us, for the PR folks, and nearly all of them make it completely free for journalists to submit their queries seeking experts, right? And the pay for services generally have more built-in tools and some more community around it, feel more like a social network. For example, Quoted allows you to register your source so that if somebody's just browsing for a source, they could find one. Whereas the ones that are going over email like SOS, those are just a manual sort of email back and forth, right? Quoted also offers some more alerting and favoriting and tracking of the inquiry and your response. You can see if people have opened it or if they're done reading them, or sometimes even they reply to you through that interface. Whereas some of the other ones we're talking about are more sort of limited in their nature. I think the functionality that existed for HARO that has been discontinued was more similar to Quoted.
Yeah, it was called Connectively. I think they rebranded it. Yeah, they've just sunsetted that. Yeah, so this is a tool, like Quoted is a tool, like you build your profile of your spokesperson and then you can be discovered and you can say, hey, look, here are all the other places I've been quoted. I've been on these podcasts. And then a reporter can presumably see that. And this is not a thing that a startup would have. It's relatively expensive. I think it's $750 a month up. So you're not going to just get this. It's like HubSpot or something. So you're not just going to get this unless you're an agency. But almost all agencies will use this kind of tool or several of these tools to sort of discover reporters who are looking for sources. And then, as Chris has said, it's the first that gets on this. It is not uncommon to see 60, 100 submissions against these queries. If you're in AI, 100 responses to common queries. So to Ian's point earlier, they might just take the first 10 and then close it because you're not going to look through 100 of these. So even if you've got a brilliant comment, if it's the 99th, you're done. So Chris, tell us a little bit about success here. Speed is one.
Yes. So speed crossed with, for lack of a better word, usefulness. I'm going to keep banging that drum.
Yeah.
A successful, timely pitch obviously needs to be timely, but it also needs to fill a slot in the reporter's story. Most news stories have a structure. It's not set in stone necessarily, but you see the same patterns occur over and over. Typically in a breaking news story or a story written in a breaking news style, you will have, say, a summary of the news, a quote from someone directly involved in the news, a quote, if that entity is not the company involved, then you have a quote from the company. But then down from the middle to the end, you have, assuming there's room for it in the story, you will get more analysis. So that's where you see experts weighing in on the larger significance of the day's news. And that's typically where you have an opportunity to weigh in. And there's room for one, maybe two voices like yours in the story. So you have to think, what am I going to say? Like, how can I be the one voice included? So one thing you need to do is have a voice. As a PR person, I say, I have an expert available to comment on this. And this expert in 2 or 3 lines has these kinds of creds, so you can trust what they're saying. This is basically what they would say on the topic. Go ahead and use this quote if it works for you. Otherwise, happy to get you something along these lines if it's not quite the point you're looking for someone to make or the topic you're looking for someone to address. But you need to give them you need to give the reporter a sense of what your spokesperson can say, and it needs to sound like speech. And that is so hard for many startups to generate, even for big companies to generate, because if the marketing department is coming up with something to say, now the marketing department is used to producing marketing copy, and marketing copy for all of its benefits and uses it doesn't sound like people speak most times. You need to convert your message to something conversational, and you also need to decenter yourself from the message, because again, you're trying to be useful to the reporter. You're trying to add to their story. They're not looking to embed an advertisement for your product in their story. That's what you would want. That's what you as the client, the company, the commenter would probably love to see, but that's not realistic. What you're trying to do is provide something that the reporter and their audience wouldn't otherwise know that is true and interesting. And so that's where the preparation comes in. Unless you've thought this through as a PR agency, as a PR department in-house, it's very unlikely you're going to get to that message on the spot under a tight deadline, getting all the stakeholders on board who need to sign off on it. In a dream scenario, you have an SME, like a subject matter expert, who is authorized to speak. Typically, this would be a CEO, and they're just full of interesting conversational ideas, and they love to engage with the media, and they just knock out 4 lines at the drop of a hat. That's a unicorn. You don't typically get that. So you have to have worked through a conversational approach to your messaging to begin with. On top of that, typically, it's hard for most startups to have a distinctive message. That's the ideal solution, but a lot of times startups sort of converge on the same idea. So it's hard to be distinctive this way. That's why in many cases, data is your best emissary for this kind of pitch, because if properly constructed, it is by definition material nobody else has. And if you've planned out the data project with media in mind, hopefully you've gathered data that is going to be timely and useful to reporters over, ideally, like we have at least one client who put out data earlier this year, 2024, and we're seeing it turned out to be a piece of data about how managers are feeling and how stressed they are and on how they're regarded by people above and below them. And that data is so useful for so many kinds of stories about the workplace that it just keeps showing up over and over again. That there gets at another principle here, which is that the more reps you have approaching reporters with different versions of the same core message or the same data, the more it will show up in stories, and then reporters will pick up on those stories. They'll come to you for different versions of that message or that data. And so that's why when we construct these programs for our clients, it plays such a big role. I think it's so much harder than it used to be to establish trust and establish a personal relationship with a reporter as a company. So data plays the role that opinion used to play like 10, 15 years ago.
When I think about how do you prepare for rapid response, I think about, okay, what do we care about when news breaks? And so you think about what kind of data would we like to have, or what kind of insight would we like to have? Well, the first thing is, can you help me size the impact of this news? So any data that kind of helps describe, hey, is there a way we can put a volume to this, put a put an amplitude to this thing that happened, right? And I think the second thing that people are looking for is what were the causes? What drove this? Why did this happen? And then that's an opportunity to provide some insight. Harder there. Then it gets back to some of the other principles we're talking to. Why should your opinion? And then the hardest one is what should happen next, right? How is this remedied, or how should the market change, and that kind of stuff. And that isn't always in that first round of stories, but slowly, if it's a big enough event, this is how it changes. And for my time in the crisis agency, that's also the order we tended to approach things. Okay, let's figure out, does this affect how much? Let's figure out who we need to focus on here. They're going to want to know how this happened and why, but they're also going to want to know, when is it over, or when's the next step here? And so I think it's the same kind of thing, because that's how news at its core is, okay, this is something that matters that we don't understand yet, and help us get our mind around this. So I think you can anticipate what you'd be best at across different issues, right? As we go back to like, how do you prep, right? Like for some of those things, you're not going to have a way to measure impact. But I think back to things a few years back, like the solar winds hack, and how the coverage unfolded there. And it was exactly that. It was like, show me graphs about the size of this, show me all the companies affected. And it went through those different stages. And you're going to be more equipped to weigh in at different parts of that stage, but you can anticipate, I think, which one you'll be best at.
So we've established you need to be quick. You need to have a strong opinion. It needs to be in human speak, not marketing speak. You need to have data if you want to be successful with this. What are some of the common mistakes that startups make here? It feels like conversion rate here, given it's a competitive marketplace, is going to be low. So I feel like you need to get enough reps in, because if it takes a long time, hey, it's our CEO who's the spokesperson and they're busy, and the CEO has signed off on this few lines of text and we've submitted it. There's an expectation that's going to convert. If it took 24 hours to get this thing out, the conversion rate is going to be low. And so one mistake I feel, I don't know if it's even a mistake, but it's a setting of expectations that, what's the stat? 17% of these might convert, maybe 10% might convert. It's a volume game on those sort of inbound things until you've built your profile in this area, and you've got to do that over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you have to recognize you're asking, your contact, depending on how many layers are there to their organization, to go ahead and make asks of different people's time. You have to assess each rapid response opportunity individually. Sometimes these are wishing well opportunities, I call them. Yeah, AI, I got a comment. I'll throw my penny in there. Maybe I'll be chosen. It might not be the best one to start with, or to be among your first rapid response pushes within your client or within your organization. I think another mistake is, mistaking volume as a high effort level. So that's going to engender trust with the client. In fact, they'll just see the misses too often. So making sure that you're focusing on those things that are relevant to you, that are more likely for you. And also, I assume it doesn't need to be said, but make it relevant. Don't be pitching something that's in poor taste after some bad thing happens. You're not there to go, they should have used this and it wouldn't have happened, right? Like those kinds of pitches will not just not land, they'll probably get you deleted from the source list in some cases. So, those are some quick mistakes that people make. But I also think there's the unforced errors around choosing the wrong thing to go after because it's fast and because it seems like it's in your area, and not really considering, okay, who does this affect? Oh, let's go and talk about this outage for this provider. Oh, whoops, they're a customer of my client, or they are a key partner. The sad part about news is it tends to focus on the bad part of things that are happening. So jumping into every stream comes with some dangers.
Yeah, I think I would expand on Morgan's point about how often I see clients try out rapid response and then pull back on it because the first foray or two did not result in coverage. I almost said was not successful, but I don't think that's the right way to think about it, because this is a kind of exercise where success is not binary. If you've put a good perspective in front of a reporter and they don't use it, that was not wasted effort. However, all too often from the client side, it is perceived that way. And the reason is that the marketing team, with good reason, feels that they have a limited number of credits to spend with their SMEs. And that if they've taken this important executive's time to come up with a perspective and it doesn't go anywhere, then they don't feel they can go back to another time. And that is a fundamental sort of structural challenge with this kind of pitching, because in my experience, with pitching in general, but with rapid response pitching in particular, the more you do it, the more successful you are, and you're rarely successful right off the bat, especially when you're just getting a program rolling from a cold start. Part of it is you need to figure out what messages land, and you also need to get reporters used to hearing from you and trusting you. And if you're not set up internally with those obstacles in mind, you're not likely to be successful with this kind of pitch. So that's an organizational challenge that a startup needs to take on if it wants to do this kind of pitching. And I think it is important to do this kind of pitching in a successful, proactive program, because to Ian's point, you need to be relevant. Like, irrelevance is the number one sin that you hear reporters complain about. As long as I've been in PR, I've been listening to reporters and watching them complain about, with completely justifiably, about off-base pitches that land in their inbox, or people who call them out of the blue with something, who, number one, call them out of the blue, which they, most hate now. But then on top of that, to add to the indignity, the pitch is something that they would never in a million years cover. And then they're getting this 50 times a day. So you have to be on target, but this is part of the larger project of establishing trust. And the largest mistake I think that startups make in this area is that they don't commit to all of the activities and preparation needed to make themselves a trusted source for the media. And part of that is just showing up. Part of that is showing up with material that is relevant. And part of it is establishing your bona fides with the reporters you're trying to have a relationship with. If they include you as an expert in their story, they're going out on a limb. And if you're showing up out of nowhere, especially these days when they might be writing multiple stories a day, they're much less likely to take a flyer on a company they've never heard of with an opinion they're not sure about, especially. Like, why would they trust you? So this project is all about establishing trust. And if you are not committing to what it takes to do that, then you're just not likely, your pitches are not likely to land.
Great point to end with. I think this is an important part of a PR program. It's a lot of fun when it works, getting in on breaking news, showing your opinion, getting the chance to sort of get in on a major story that is outside the sort of efforts of your own business. But it is an investment. It's a muscle that needs to be built in your startup that will pay off over time, as Chris has just said. So thanks, Chris and Ian, for just talking us through what is rapid response, where does it fit in terms of media relations overall, what do we think about newsjacking. I think we've got some good advice in there. I really appreciate that. And thank you all for listening and watching. If you like this, please do follow us. We'd love to get a comment or review. And we'll just wrap up by wishing you all happy Thanksgiving.